Hey, it's J. T. Also known as JT the LA Storyteller. Here are Los Cuentos de Los Angeles. Also known as JT the LA Storyteller Podcast. Okay, so it's time to vote, and you're getting some flack from folks about finally getting out that ballot and filling it out, but you need to know where to start. And if that is the case, then you have come to the right place. Welcome to this edition of the Los Cuentos wrap-up for JT the LA Storyteller Podcast, which is taking a look at the various propositions that are before us here in the state of California for this fall 2024. And so, as a note from yours truly, just so that you know, I've been voting in the state of California and the city of Los Angeles most consistently since at least 2015 through 2016 and onwards. So that is to say that I've seen a few different things here and there when it's come to the state asking voters what it thinks about a few different initiatives it's got in mind. And so with that in mind, I want to go through these propositions one by one just so that, hey, you are a more informed voter and you can pass that information along to everyone else who you may know or be connected with out there. So without further ado, let's go ahead and take a look at the various possibilities that the state of California is outlining for folks this fall 2024. Starting with Proposition 2. There we go. Okay. So Proposition 2, let me also note that we are using CalMatters and the CalMatters website for summaries of the various propositions because CalMatters, in my opinion, has kind of done the best job of the publications in and around Los Angeles of keeping up with the state, including the Senate and the Assembly, as well as where Governor Newsom is at and what Governor Newsom says here or there. And so, yeah, it's kind of a natural fit that they're the website or platform I'd go to for a quick and concise breakdown of the various propositions. So if you haven't visited CalMatters just yet, I highly recommend that you do so ASAP because, hey, they get it done. They get it done. And so speaking of getting it done, Prop 2, at least the official title of Prop 2, notes that it authorizes bonds for public school and community college facilities, as well as that it's a legislative statute. And this is from the Secretary of State's office, which you can also access online and which I'm happy to provide a link for. And so when one reads that, and when one reads the text of Proposition 2, it can be just a little, not overwhelming, but just a little bit more than we'd like to parse through, right? So as a result, CalMatters here notes that, hey, what the measure is really asking for is the right for the state to borrow $10 billion to build schools and colleges. And so, to be more specific, the proposition would authorize the state to borrow $8.5 billion for K through 12 schools and $1.5 billion for community colleges for construction and modernization. And so, I think that when it comes to something like Proposition 2, for yours truly, after about 8 consistent years of voting on California ballots here in the city of Los Angeles or here from the city of Los Angeles, I am very much going to vote no on Proposition 2. simply because there's so much for us to consider when it comes to borrowing money, right? I mean, think about your own life and what debts you have to pay and exactly how many expenses you have for yourself on any given week or through any given month, and essentially take that same reasoning that you would in your own life when it comes to borrowing money and apply it to what the state is asking for here. When it says that we're looking to borrow essentially $10 billion for school modernization and for community college rebuilding or retrograding, what is really going on there? And what I mean is, how many limited liability corporations stand to benefit from a bond such as this, which inherently isn't wrong, but which, hey, can go so many different directions real quick when we really break it down? And how many banks stand to benefit from this bond? That's what I'd really love for the Secretary of State to ask voters, and that's what I'd really love for a discussion when it comes to bonds in general to really note for voters out there, right? Because I said this on a recent article via Making a Neighborhood just as well, which I'll also provide in the show notes. When it comes to any bond or any loan, obviously that loan has an interest rate, and obviously that loan also has a certain length of time that it will be applied through, right? So that's exactly what this comes down to just as well. The state of California is saying, hey, can we borrow $10 billion on X amount of years or during X amount of years and use that to upgrade our schools, including our K through 12 schools, as well as our community colleges. And I think especially after the pandemic, the economy has shifted. And if you hadn't noticed, between the years of 2010 through 2020, a lot of people actually left the state of California. In fact, the state of California for the first time ever lost a congressional district and seat because the population shrunk for the first time in the state's history. So this is just to say that what is going on in terms of affordability here in the state of California and through cities like Los Angeles and San Francisco and even San Diego is that shout out to San Diego and all the cities that don't take up as much space as the aforementioned. But when it comes to them, the fact of the matter is that, hey, the city today doesn't look like what it did yesterday. So we have to have a meaningful conversation as to what schools we're going to rebuild and which we are not, right? Because otherwise, we're just building without purpose. And not only are we doing that, we're doing that at the same time that a bank out there, that these big banks out there, which have gotten enough handouts, which get enough subsidies from the government as is, we're doing that as they reap serious benefits that they keep for themselves, that the billionaires class is not letting go anywhere, right? I really believe that, and I really care about that. And so when it comes to borrowing $10 billion to rebuild schools and community colleges for this fall 2024, yours truly is going to pass on this proposition because I am not of the mind that it's time to borrow money for these things. I'm of the mind that the California state budget should account for this, and that the Assembly, as well as the Senate in California, not to mention Governor Newsom, that they should really get to work and build out a budget that apportions funds to our schools from the K through 12 level, as well as at the university level and the community college level accordingly. And this is because if the fifth largest economy in the world cannot get it done, then I don't know what to tell you. But the money is there. The money can be found. And I'd love for us to track it down so that we're not asking voters permission to go to the bank on this. I don't think that that's in any way appropriate, especially given what we've seen when it comes to the state of California's management of these billions of dollars that voters approve over the years. Am I right? Hint, hint. Okay, that's enough for Proposition 2 for now. let's move on to proposition number 3, which is officially titled as the constitutional right to marriage, and which is a legislative constitutional amendment. So if you're a child of the aughts and if you came of age during the early 2Ks, you'll remember something about a Proposition 8, even if only faintly or vaguely. And Proposition 8 was basically this measure that was passed by voters at the time, just a little over 16 years ago, that solidified marriage between just men and women. This would eventually go on to be overturned by a superior court, if not the Supreme Court of the state of California, not long after the measure was passed. And since that time, gay marriage has been entirely legal in the state of California, and people have just come to accept that as a basic fact of life here, right? And so this is kind of not turning back the clock, but just securing this on the California Constitution, because it is a legislative constitutional amendment. And hey, all power to it. There are not any major groups organizing against this, though I think 1 or 2 assembly members wrote in opposition of the measure at some point. Never mind them. With that in mind, I would like to say that there are other parts of California records that I would love to see scrutinized. And it's not and when I say that, I'm not talking about the California Constitution, but I'm talking about, say, housing covenants all across the state of California, and the deed restrictions that they still have in order or in effect to one extent or another, though they're no longer enforced as they once were in the state. And so, if we're going to be doing this digging, I'd love to dig and have the state of California really come to terms with other forms of discrimination against the most vulnerable populations here. So, by all means, I think Prop 3 is going to pass by a landslide, but I'm not the only one who thinks that. Obviously, you know that Prop 3 is kind of a shoo-in here, very much a shoo-in. Who are we kidding? So 2 down, 8 more to go. Proposition 4, another loan. Just another loan. And so in this case, Proposition 4 is officially titled as authorizing bonds for safe drinking water, wildfire prevention, and protecting communities and natural lands from climate risks. And it also notes that this is a legislative statute. And so here, Cal Matters is once again on the dot, noting that, hey, this proposition is asking for permission to borrow $10 billion to respond to climate change in the state of California. And to be certain, the text notes that this bond would allow the state to borrow $3.8 billion for drinking water and groundwater programs, as well as $1.5 billion for wildfire and forest programs, and $1.2 billion for sea level rise. In part, the money would offset some budget cuts. Right. So once again, the California Congress and basically our legislators in Sacramento have asked the voters to offset their inability to manage the budget accordingly with respect to climate change. The last time that I checked, the state of California's gross domestic product was $3.9 trillion. And somehow, despite all of the economic activity and all of the economic output here, somehow now the state of California finds itself in a deficit. This is due to our weird tax system, as Cal Matters and other platforms have pointed out. And now it is set to cut and reduce and basically eliminate wildfire prevention and forest programs because we have simply not found the money to do this within our 3.9 trillion economic output. And so I'm flabbergasted, not only at the fact that this measure is being placed in front of voters' hands, but I'm flabbergasted that our media institutions out here haven't discussed this measure and this knack for borrowing, this penchant, this addiction to borrowing at the state level as much as they can and as much as they should, right? Because once again, as noted when it came to Proposition 2, we are just borrowing this money. It does not currently exist, and $10 billion are not currently allotted in this way for these programs, but the idea is that we'll go to the banks and we'll say, if you write us a check for $10 billion, this is what it will go to. And shout out to bigbadbonds.com here, because I can't help but shout them out and think of them as I reflect on this proposition here that is being placed in front of us, because they note that when it comes to the execution of the proposition's language and the proposition's, say, the proposition's logic, the proposition's text and specifics, there is very little to ensure enforcement that is actually at play here. So as voters who get to see and participate in, say, the state's budgeting process every handful of years through the ballot, through ballot box budgeting, as is the case here, we have so many different things to contend with on an everyday basis, right? We have our own budgets to deal with. We have our own families to create finances for. We have our own debts to pay off, especially if you're a student, especially if you have bought a home recently or bought a car that you needed to get to and from work. And so you're not really thinking on a day-to-day basis about the $3.9 trillion budget that is California. Here you have a handful of months. Let's say that, between March and November, we're talking about 8 months to think about whether or not it's okay to borrow money when it comes to climate change in the state of California, which touts itself, or which Governor Newsom has touted as a progressive beacon for the nation. So, does it make sense that we should invest in these programs? Absolutely it does. But what doesn't make sense to yours truly is why we need to borrow that money instead of accounting for it on our own budget. Where is that money? Where are those billions of dollars? We can find 10 billion in 3.9 trillion, but now we're asking for the banks to hand us that, and I'm flabbergasted. I'm just flabbergasted at so many levels. But what I will say for now is that I'm definitely passing on this. I'm voting no on Proposition 4 because I don't know where this is coming from, and I would love to know more before I go ahead and have the state sign on my behalf for it. So that's how I feel about Prop 4. Let's move on to Prop 5 now. So now Proposition 5 states that, at least officially, the name for Proposition 5 states that it would allow local bonds for affordable housing and public infrastructure with 55% voter approval. This would also act as a legislative constitutional amendment. And so what we would do in this instance, I suppose, is, I don't need to suppose, the text is right in front of me here via Cal Matters. What it would do is essentially go to the California Constitution and make an amendment which would make it easier for local governments to borrow money for affordable housing and some other public infrastructure projects by lowering the voter approval requirement from 2/3, or about 66%, to 55%. And in this scenario, although this is the third bond that is being proposed by the state of California for voters this fall, I will say that although I'm vehemently opposed to borrowing money without more specifics when it comes to the state of California, I do have to note that since it involves housing and the construction of housing, and since we are in a housing crisis here in the state of California, I want to pause a little bit just before I dismiss this out of hand, right? But what is it really saying? at the end of the day. It's saying that it's just giving permission to cities to vote on local bonds or local loans when it comes to building affordable housing and public infrastructure by lowering the threshold from 6 out of 10 voters to just a little over 5 out of 10 voters. And I don't know. I think I really have to weigh that one out for myself, because at the end of the day, this doesn't mean much. It doesn't mean much for the state to give cities permission from 66 to 55% when it comes to housing. There's a lot that gets in the way of actually building housing in the state of California and really across the nation. And there's a lot that the federal government needs to account for when it comes to actually getting the housing up and running. There is too much. And it's because the federal government, though it was happy to redline neighborhoods and communities all throughout the 1930s, well into the years leading up to World War II, and although it was happy to create homogenized or homogeneous suburbs all across the country up until the 1960s, maybe even all the way up to 1970, since just after 1970, it really hasn't taken the time to go after housing on a meaningful level. And there is a slight conversation about that at the sort of presidential level up to a point, but it's not that serious. We've spent far more time thinking about immigration in the United States than we have spent thinking about housing and the need for housing, and the fact that there are millions of people out there living from check to check and at risk of homelessness because of the dearth of housing in their community, whether they're in California or beyond, whether they're in California or Des Moines, Ohio. Forgive me if I don't know your Midwest city and so on, but it's no dig to the Midwest. Shout out to all the workers everywhere on the West and the East and throughout every community in which they're to be found, because we still run this. So when it comes to Prop 5, I'd actually really like to hear more and study it more. As of right now, I don't have a recommendation. I'm in a little bit of a real thinking process about this one. So if I hear of anything and update my position before too long, go ahead and check back with Jimbo Times. In fact, hit that subscribe button so that we can really get into Prop 5. But before then, I'm just going to sort of pause on this and provide no recommendation one way or the other, because there's so much more than just allowing cities to go from 66% approval for new housing, including affordable housing, to 55%. There's so much more to it than that. But okay, we'll get back to it before too long, at least certainly before it's time on November 5th. With that said, let's move on to Prop 6, because time is of the essence here. Prop 6 states that it would eliminate the constitutional provision allowing involuntary servitude for incarcerated persons. This would also be a legislative constitutional amendment. And so to this, I have to say shout out to the folks who put this before voters, because this is the kind of constitutional amendment that I'm talking about. As of right now, indentured servitude, once you are incarcerated in the state of California, is entirely legal and entirely in practice. And so this would, of course, limit forced labor in state prisons. And I think that's probably the right thing to do in 2024 or the 21st century. But believe it or not, there are some folks who would argue otherwise. There are some folks who are very much opposed to ending something like forced servitude or forced labor or slavery, as others have framed it in the state of California, because they don't believe that people who are convicted of a crime should actually have rights that they can maintain. And so, yeah, they're out there, but you won't find them on this installment of JT the LA Storyteller podcast, because this is an easy yes. We should absolutely limit forced labor in state prisons. And to be certain, Cal Matters points out that this constitutional amendment would end indentured servitude in state prisons, considered one of the last remnants of slavery. The California Black Legislative Caucus included the proposal in its reparations agenda. And so a fascinating proposition to place on the ballot this year, but I think it's just about time. I think just about a decade after Prop 47 was passed in 2014, I think we're absolutely in the right state to inform voters that this is taking place, for one, and that they have the opportunity to end it once and for all. So I do have to recognize the caucus for putting together a meaningful proposal before us, and my hope is that it passes by a landslide, by 80%, if not more. And I know that it won't be 100% because, once again, there are these private interests out there, and there are these real LLCs who are not to be played with when it comes to these matters, and who are really trying to force the measure otherwise, or to defeat the measure. But shout out to those who are going to pass this without hesitation, because I can't even begin to describe just how fascinating it is that we're just getting to this. But I'm glad to support Prop 6 and to vote yes on Prop 6. Okay, similarly, for Prop 32, which would raise the state minimum wage to $18, once again, although in the city of Los Angeles, the minimum wage was raised recently to $17 an hour, the fact of the matter is that workers everywhere should obtain a living wage. And really, when you break it down, and when you break down the cost of housing in particular in something like the city of Los Angeles, I think the minimum wage is supposed to be at somewhere over 40. It's between 40 and 50 when it comes to what the living wage should be just in Los Angeles, because of the cost of a one-bedroom apartment and how that figures into a person's budget on a day-to-day basis out there. So by all means, I am for raising the minimum wage to $18, and that's an easy yes. I think it should be for you too. Okay, Prop 33. Yeah, now it's getting real interesting. with once again another allowance, right? The state of California has so much respect for these cities that it wants to ask permission before it allows cities to impose rent controls. Now, impose is the word being used by Cal Matters here, and as noted earlier, Cal Matters is great, but I think that's an interesting term, kind of a slightly misleading term up to a point, but that's just me for the time being. The official text of Prop 33 notes that it would expand the local government's authority to enact rent control on residential property, and that this would be an initiative statute. And so here, what the state of California is really saying is that cities would have the ability to apply rent control in both single-family housing units and also beyond the strict Costa-Hawkins limitations that are applied currently and that have been applied since about 1995 when Costa-Hawkins was first passed. So Cal Matters points out, to be sure, that this is the latest attempt to roll back a state law that generally prevents cities and counties from limiting rents in properties first occupied after February 1st, 1995. And so naturally, the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association and the Association of Apartment Owners in California and a number of realtors' interests are opposed to rent control. And as for yours truly, similarly as we noted for Prop, was it 5? Yeah, which would allow cities to go from a 66% to a 55% threshold for applying something like the borrowing of loans for affordable housing, quote, affordable housing, unquote, projects in their municipalities. I am similarly skeptical about just what permission for cities across the state of California to apply rent control would in fact do for the housing crisis and housing crises that we face here, right? So I'm very sort of nonplussed by Prop 33, and this is also because the AIDS Healthcare Foundation is a huge funder of the initiative, and the AIDS Healthcare Foundation over the years really has not made a case for itself as a housing expert, given its role in SRO units in the Skid Row area of downtown Los Angeles. And so yours truly shouted that out in my conversation with Elizabeth Chu of the LA Public Press. And if you haven't checked out that convo yet on Prop 36, as well as Prop 33 and a few other measures, I definitely recommend that you check it out for yourself, because it's a great discussion on, well, just what we're looking at in the state when it comes to these. So I'm nonplussed about Prop 33, but I'm not going to say that I'm for or against it quite yet. I'm just going to say that this is one of those which definitely requires additional research on the part of voters. So go ahead and check out some more info about it and see how you feel. But my sort of gut feeling at the moment, or my intuition, tells me that Prop 33 will not pass, and that cities are going to have to figure something else out other than rent control, which in and of itself is great, but which, at least in the city of Los Angeles, for example, has had a significant but nonetheless limited effect on the gentrification of the neighborhood one way or the other, right? So we can have some pretty real discussions out there about just how rent control has allowed communities to hang on out there, including communities like that of yours truly, while the rest of the neighborhood has very much been nonetheless dismantled because of things like Cash for Keys, or the Cash for Keys programs, where investors and their subsidiaries come in and just buy up or buy out renters, even though they have rent-controlled units, and then flip that to create whole new rents for higher income tenants, which then, of course, gentrifies the neighborhood, and on and on and on. So, yeah, I'm not exactly enthused about Prop 33 and the fact that it's being funded by Michael Weinstein of the AIDS Healthcare Foundation is also a part of that, because I don't like his or the foundation's track record on housing in the city of Los Angeles, and I really got to keep that in mind as I think about this proposition. Okay, that's Prop 33 for us. With that in mind, up on our list, third from last, is Prop 34, which officially restricts spending of prescription drug revenues by certain healthcare providers. This is also an initiative statute, and in the words of Cal Matters, it is sponsored by the Trade Group for California's Landlords, and this measure is squarely aimed at kneecapping the AIDS Healthcare Foundation, which has been active in funding ballot measures. Right. So this is interesting because it's kind of like a battle of billionaires, one might say, right? We were just talking about Michael Weinstein and his sort of outsized influence on politics in the state of California, as well as housing in the city of Los Angeles. And here, on the other hand, you have these folks who are saying, hey, take the money that you're making from the billion-dollar industry that is the AIDS Healthcare Foundation, or the billion-dollar corporation. I should probably say, and use that money back on your patients rather than on political initiatives in the state of California. It really doesn't get better than this, right? Because this is one set of billionaires saying to another billionaire, hey, stay out of the politics. And so I do have to say that I'm really in the middle when it comes to this. I don't think that money in politics and major money in politics has done any good for us since Citizens United versus the FEC. And I don't know that I like Michael Weinstein and his input on California politics, but I also think that voters are smart and that voters can recognize a lot of these billionaires, with the exception of some like Uber and Lyft, when they sort of veil themselves very well on the ballot and through what they sponsor on the ballot and the kind of laws they want to repeal or reduce or eliminate altogether, despite the wishes of working people in the state of California. I will say that, yeah, I think voters can generally spot a lot of misinformation out there, but at the same time, who are we kidding? When it comes to these social media feeds and when it comes to the way that misinformation proliferates out there, I do subscribe to the idea that a lie travels halfway around the world before the truth can get its boots on. And so I am kind of certainly friendly towards the notion that, hey, billionaires and billion-dollar corporations out there, like the AIDS Healthcare Foundation, should stay in healthcare and stay on pharmaceuticals and stay committed to their lane. I do have to note that feels very fair to me. So I'm leaning towards a yes, but I'm not entirely set on that. And so I am open to some feedback on Prop 34 because I think it's a funny discussion to have in the 21st century, but this is the age of Elon Musk, and this is the United States of Amazon. And so, yeah, we need to have these types of discussions throughout our country because the billionaires have come to tinker with our state laws and with how we budget out here, including on issues as critical as housing, and it's kind of time to have a convo about that. So yeah, let's do that. For right now, I'm just going to pass on making any recommendation on Prop 34. Let's move on to Prop 35 then, which would make permanent a tax on managed healthcare plans, and which officially states that it would provide permanent funding for Medi-Cal healthcare services, and that this would be an initiative statute. This is funny because the federal government does have a hand in how something such as Medi-Cal plays out, and I do fear the repercussions that may be at play if we certify and promise funding for something like Medi-Cal when, in fact, we cannot do that, since the federal government is substantially involved in the budget that such a program sees every year. Similarly to Prop 34, I'm sort of not feeling strongly in one direction or the other. But hey, this is what I think the AIDS Healthcare Foundation has placed in front of voters, because I think Prop 33 and Prop 35 are kind of their big two in this fall 2024's ballot. And since I have been skeptical, since I noted great skepticism about the AIDS Healthcare Foundation's efficacy when it comes to these kinds of issues, I do have to note that I am skeptical of Prop 35 just as well. I wonder about the reasoning behind something like permanent funding, quote, permanent funding, unquote, for programs such as Medi-Cal when the state of California is not strictly responsible for its funding. Yeah, I do want to pause on making a recommendation here one way or the other, but right now my sense is that it's a no for Jimbo Times or JT the LA Storyteller, and I'll let you know if I change my mind on that. Yeah. Last but not least, we move on to Prop 36. And Prop 36 forms the bulk of my discussion with Elizabeth Chu from the LA Public Press and is officially titled, at least on our ballots, as a measure which allows felony charges and which increases sentences for certain drug and theft crimes, and that this would be an initiative statute. Cal Matters, on the other hand, notes that this measure, supported by Republicans and law enforcement, but opposed by Governor Gavin Newsom and most Democrats, may be the most contentious on the ballot, because it would partly roll back Prop 47, which was approved by us, including yours truly, in 2014, which turns some felonies into misdemeanors. And so, yeah, I did hear a great talk via UCLA recently that featured a professional who noted that, hey, really a lot of what Prop 36 is actually offering to voters is kind of already on the agenda for the California Congress as is, but the California Congress couldn't pass enough of these new measures and sort of amendments to Prop 47 in time before Prop 36 got out to voters. And so in a way, even after we vote down Prop 36, it is still the California Congress's responsibility to regulate how laws such as Prop 47 will be instituted or applied. And so for me, it is very much a no, because Prop 36 seeks to do the work of the California Congress in one of these haphazard and half thought out or very quickly drawn out fashions. And I'm against anything that is rushed and that is placed as a so-called solution to a problem that is much bigger than Prop 47. And that has much to do with, once again, our housing crisis, ultimately. And for more on that, and for more conversations regarding just how far the housing issue spans for so many different communities across the state of California and across the U.S., just check out some of these earlier discussions, including my discussion with Renee Rose, who is running for the Superior Court judge seat in Los Angeles, because it really tells you a lot about just how when people don't have a place to live or an opportunity to find a place to live for themselves, they resort to all sorts of crisis and all sorts of trauma responses. And guess what? Going out and participating in retail theft is unfortunately a part of that. But to pin this solely on individuals as though they are responsible for the housing crises they find themselves in 2024, for me, is just completely unjustified. And so I'm very much opposed to Prop 36, and I recommend a no vote on this. And okay, with this said, that about does it for our Los Cuentos wrap-up on the 2024 ballot this fall. I've had a good time, and I definitely spent more time talking about these measures than I really intended to, but hey, this is just my opinion as someone who's voted in the state of California and in Los Angeles since at least 2014, because I do remember casting a vote for Prop 47 even way back in 2014. But hey, I thought I'd give you the number 8 over the number 10 just for good measure there. And so, yeah, with this in mind, go ahead and take a look at some of the propositions that we paused on and do some more research for yourself. If you find out anything interesting that we should note and get out there for voters' reference before November 5th, by all means, reach out in the comments or anywhere else that you keep up with yours truly, and I'll be happy to get into that. In the meantime, it has been a pleasure, and until the very next time, stay vigilant and stay tuned. It's J.T. Out with more soon. Hey, it's J.T. Also known as JT the LA Storyteller. Here are Los Cuentos de Los Angeles. Also known as JT the LA Storyteller Podcast.